Now we saw some footage of Buzz Aldrin talking about the Apollo craft being followed to the moon by a UFO. He's made other statements about Phobos. Just tell us about that, Andrew.
Yeah, well, this is very peculiar, and I think, you know, surprised a lot of people. And he comes out on C-SPAN, which is a US cable channel, saying that there's a monolith being discovered on Phobos, and, you know, this should reinvigorate the space program. That we should right. Go and investigate this.
Just celestial body which orbits around the planet Mars.
Right.
Quite small, only about 15 miles across, shaped like a large potato, effectively. And in this next clip, we hear Aldrin making that claim.
If there's something very important to be developed from the moon, I'm not sure what it is right now. And I sure think we should identify what it is for America to make such gross expenditures again for human habitation on the moon. We can help. We can join with. Together, we can explore the moon and develop the moon. We should go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put that there? Well, the universe put it there. If you choose, God put it there.
All right, now this sparked items in national newspapers after he'd said this, and in particular I saw the Mail Online article.
Well, again, if you read the actual article, I mean, we were talking about this last night, and it is a little bit confusing when you read the article, because there are several pictures shown in the article, and you know, we'll show these on the screen, but it appears that one of them is indeed on Phobos, but it looks more like a large mound than a monolith, and then there's another monolith image, which is actually, I found out through further research, is in Valles Marineris on the surface of Mars. So it's odd that Aldrin would confuse these two things, and I don't even know whether one was originally released at one time and one at another time. And then there is a third image in this Daily Mail article. You know, and we can probably bring these images up on the screen. We've got a third image in the Daily Mail article. I looked and looked and looked for several hours to see if I could find a source for this third image. It doesn't. Again, it doesn't look like a monolith. It looks more like a square-looking you know, post. And I could not find the original source for that image. Whereas the one in Valles Marineris, you know, I could give people the original NASA image link for that image, and indeed there is something which looks like a monolith there. And again, we've got this other, I made this little video clip of Phobos, right. And it appears there are lots of these things that look like monoliths. There are probably about 5 or 6 of them. Right,
so this is an image of the surface of Phobos that you've got from NASA, and you've made a little video sort of scanning from one area of Phobos to the other.
Correct.
And these are, they've got quite long shadows on them.
Yes.
But we don't really know what they are.
Correct. And then, you know, we have an additional image which we'll show from the European Space Agency, which appears to show the monolith on Phobos from a completely different angle. It's a colour image as opposed to this, you know, this little video clip is black and white, because the original image is black and white. But we have another ESA image, the European Space Agency, that is, from I believe it's Mars Express, showing this monolith from two separate images. Actually, it's very strange.
Just for viewers who might not be following the significance of this, according to official records, NASA nor anyone else from Earth has ever been to Mars or been to Phobos, so there shouldn't be anything man-made or on that particular.
Right. I mean, you know, the whole situation with NASA is that there is no evidence of any other intelligence in the solar system other than on Earth. Any other object that we look at in the solar system, according to the official sort of NASA and other lines, all we're seeing is rocks. We may be seeing some other oddities, but if we are seeing other oddities, we have no information as to what they might be. That's sort of official stance on these things.
Now, another interesting fact about Phobos is that it has been proven to be at least part hollow.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've got this scientific paper which was released. I mean, again, this came up on a website recently, but it actually, I found out, as with a lot of these stories, they are these stories are you know, several years old. They're put out as new stories, and they're not. They're several years old. And we have this scientific paper called "The Precise Mass Determination of and the Nature of Phobos." And this was published by, it's got about 5 authors. It was received 3rd of December 2009, revised 8th of March 2010, accepted 22nd of March 2010, and it was published 7th of May 2010 in the Geophysical Research Letters Journal, volume 37, L09202. And their conclusion in the abstract of this letter, which is like a short paper, it's not a full scientific paper, we conclude that the interior of Phobos likely contains large voids. When applied to various hypotheses bearing on the origin of Phobos, these results are inconsistent with the proposition that Phobos is a captured asteroid. And that information, as I understand it, comes from the studies of radar data, where they fired you know, radar signals at Phobos and then got signals back. I mean,
they can actually calculate. They can calculate its mass based on its orbital period and
correct.
distance from the planet.
And then if you look at the size of the object, look at its density.
Yeah.
You know, the density. It's probably got a very low density overall.
Yeah.
So that means that it must be at least partly hollow.
Right. And that's not consistent with asteroids.
No,
Asteroids are not hollow.
No.
Right. So there's something odd there.
There's something odd. There's a number of very odd things about Phobos.
Now, there was a Russian mission to Phobos in, I think, 1988. Two Russian craft unmanned, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2. Mysteriously, Phobos 1 was switched off and didn't reach its intended target. Phobos 2, again, went into trouble, and then it sent back some data. It sent back a very interesting shadow on the surface of Mars, which people were saying was a UFO, but
correct.
Other people have since said no, that was actually a shadow of Phobos. But as it was coming towards Phobos, it then malfunctioned. Is that
right? I mean, that's the gist of the story, and I'd heard this story, and I re-investigated that very recently. I've got this upcoming presentation at the end of March at the New Horizons Club in Lydon-St-Anne. So I wanted to do some re-investigation into the Phobos story. And this story obviously is comes out a lot, and it was that basically the Phobos 2, Phobos 1 was lost, as you said, probably due to human error. They accidentally switched it off and couldn't recover it. Phobos 2 was going towards Phobos, and then it took about a sequence of about 5 pictures, and they saw this object coming out, apparently coming towards Phobos 2, and this object was said by some to be a missile. And then they lost contact with it, so the sort of the implication was there that it was shot down. And these pictures were shown on Larry King Live, and there's a web article by Don Ecker which shows these pictures, or one of the pictures, but actually what it's showing you is rather a poor quality photocopy of this image. And I recently came across the original images as were seen on the Russian. On the Russian mission by the mission controllers, which we've got, and they show quite clearly that this apparent missile is actually some kind of video or digital artifact coming into the picture, because it sort of slowly comes across the picture, and then there's just basically a vertical line goes across the picture, so you can clearly see that that doesn't appear to be anything to do with a missile or anything like that. So that particular story, there's a bit of misinformation in it. Yes, indeed, Phobos 2 was lost, and we don't really know what happened to it. Right. But this, and also this thing about the shadow, the claim to photograph this weird ellipse on the surface of Mars. Well, it is now known what that is, and it is indeed the shadow of Phobos, and it's been photographed several times. And again, we've got a photograph of that here to show you that.
And there are rumours that Phobos is either artificial or used as a base of some kind. Can you expand on that at
Well,
all?
not really. I mean, you know, from this study with the radar data, that it does appear that it's hollow. One of the unusual features that we've got here in this particular image are these lines, you know, going around Phobos, which look very unusual. We've got these sets of lines, some of them intersecting at right angles on the surface, so it does look very unusual. However, there is a scientific paper which I'm sort of halfway through looking at. I don't know whether I'll be able to understand all of it, but it shows a model for how these lines could have been created. And in simple terms, because Phobos is a relatively small object, you know, as we said, 15 miles across, it's essentially got its own microgravity. So if you were to try and walk on the surface of Phobos, you know, as soon as you sort of travelled more than half a metre per second, you'd have reached the escape velocity of Phobos and you'd start floating into space.
Yeah.
So I think this paper proposes that these tracks are boulders that are sort of scraped against Phobos and then rolled around the side, just in the microgravity, and that's what's created these lines. I don't know whether that's correct, but that's one of the more conventional explanations. The other, of course, is that what we're seeing is some surface feature of some underlying structure, some, you know, plates fixed together. I don't know. I mean, I haven't studied it enough to say one way or the other. But the unusual things are, it's very small. Its orbit is actually decaying. I think you can show that Phobos will only be orbiting Mars for the next, you know, I don't know, 5,000 years or something, or 10,000 years, and then it'll crash into the surface because its orbit is decaying. And also that it appears to be hollow, and it was only discovered in about, I forget the exact date, but it was around about 1837 or not 1857. In the 19th century, which is odd because there are other objects which were as small as Phobos which had been seen within the solar system before then. So that's rather odd. Right.
Okay, Andrew. Well, we're going for a quick break, and after the break we're going to show that NASA have actually found life on Mars. Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about Mars and the possibility of life on Mars. Now, in the 1970s, NASA sent two probes, the Viking probes, which were sent, one of its missions was to specifically look for microbial life. 3 experiments. Just tell us about that, Andrew.
Yes, well, there was basically, the main experiment was to send out a robot arm from the probe with like a little scoop on it, or a spade or a shovel, whatever you want to call it, dug into the soil, and it would bring a sample of soil into the probe. It had like a chemical laboratory, a small chemical laboratory inside the probe, and they would pour like a sugary solution, but the sugary solution had radioactive carbon in it. And then if there were any bacteria, they would then, you know, feed on this sugary solution, and they would digest or, you know, process the carbon, and then they would give off carbon dioxide, and so you'd be able to detect the carbon-14, the radioactive carbon, in the gases given off. And that's indeed what happened, and they found that this gas, you know, carbon dioxide, was given off with the radioactive carbon in it, so it had been metabolized. The sugary solution had been metabolized. So that
went on, gave off CO2 for 3 days.
Correct.
Which was proof of life.
Essentially, it was proof of a life process, because if it was an ordinary chemical reaction, it wouldn't have, you know, it would have just been over in, you know, half an hour or an hour or something like that.
Then there was a second experiment which also proved life.
Right, that was, I think, they're called the pyrolytic release, and then there was a third experiment. You know, it might be better if we play some of the clip.
We'll take a look at this clip
all of that.
Of what's the chap's name?
David Darling and Ron Bennett.
Right, explaining those 3 experiments and what NASA did with that information.
I believe that Viking found life, and I think that maybe not intentionally, but scientists painted the wrong picture of what happened. You know, the message was put out that Viking found nothing more than unusual active chemicals in the soil, that basically Mars was dead. And that's had a profound effect on everything that's followed, including the direction of the whole space program. So the question is, where did things go wrong? Well, back in '76, 2 identical spacecraft, Viking 1 and 2, landed on Mars. They both carried miniature biology labs, kind of about the size of a microwave oven. It was quite small. But they had 3 experiments which were looking directly for life on Mars, and they were the first spacecraft to do this, and incredibly, the only spacecraft that have ever looked for life on another planet. You know, in the 30-odd years since then, we've never sent out another probe to look for life, and that's because the mainstream science said Viking didn't find anything. So, you know, they carried out some experiments. I just want to zero in a couple of them. One was called the label release experiment. One was called a pyrolytic release. And the agreement was beforehand, if any of these experiments found a positive signal, then we would say that they'd found life on Mars, and that was thrown out the window later on. So what the label release experiment did was it took a sample of Martian soil, it dripped some water onto it, some goodies, some nutrients, kind of like a chicken soup type of thing for bacteria. And the neat thing was that those nutrients were laced with radioactive carbon. And the hope was that any bugs in the soil would metabolize that food and they'd give off radioactive carbon dioxide, which you could then pick up with a radiation detector, a Geiger counter. And lo and behold, that's exactly what it found. A big rush of radioactive carbon dioxide, which lasted for about 3 days. Exactly what you'd expect if there were bacteria in the soil. And not what you'd expect if there was a chemical reaction. It wouldn't last that long. There's no way. The other experiment, the pyrolytic release experiment, showed that organic chemicals were manufactured in the soil by something. That's kind of hard to explain without life going on. Mm-hmm. And these two together gave life signals. So why didn't scientists say that Viking had found life? Because according to the pre-agreed criteria before Viking ever left the launch pad, both of those experiments found life. The reason was there was another instrument on board Viking, which was called the GCMS. That stands for Gas Chromatograph Mass Spectrometer. And the whole purpose of that instrument was to look for organics, organic material, anything containing carbon, basically, in the Martian soil. And that came up negative. It didn't find a single thing. It didn't find a single carbon-containing molecule in the soil. And it was used as a court of appeal, basically. So you've got 2 experiments saying, yeah, there's life here by pre-agreed criteria. Another instrument says there can't be life, no organics, you can't have life. But that instrument wasn't working properly. And we know it wasn't working properly. It's been demonstrated. It was demonstrated even before Viking took off, although it wasn't really well known or advertised. But in several studies since then, identical equipment to the GCMS has been tested on Antarctic soils, on soils from deserts regions on Earth, which are similar to Mars, and it has failed to find life where we know there is life by other instruments. And so this Court of Appeal instrument was faulty. We know it couldn't have detected organic material on Mars, and yet that's the way it panned out, that scientists used that as a way to say there's no life on Mars. So the GCMS found nothing, and so what did the Viking scientists team do? They dismissed the positive readings of the other 2 experiments, and they said that the activity in the soil was due to some kind of reactive chemical like hydrogen peroxide, and that was that.
Okay, Andrew. Well, that smacks of a cover-up to me.
Yeah, and I mean Gilbert Levin. I mean he's been very much an outspoken critic because Gilbert Levin was the scientist who designed the experiment we described before the clip, the labeled release experiment, and he actually was a bit amazed because they set out to debunk his experiment. In other words, they'd employed him to design this experiment and build it. And after it given this result, they then tried to, NASA separately did, or scientists wanted to do 50 reproductions of Levin's experiment and claim that the effect was a result of oxidation, in other words, an ordinary chemical reaction with no life process involved. And they did 50 different experiments, but Levin argues that none of them completely explained the results that he got.
Right.
And one of the other things I should add on to that, in July 2004, Professor Vittorio Formisano, who worked for ESA, he did a spectroscopy experiment from Mars Express which was the European Martian orbiter, and he was looking at the light which was coming back from the atmosphere of Mars, measuring the light and elements of the light in what's called a spectroscope, and he basically discovered biomarker gases, as they call them, in other words evidence of life in the Martian atmosphere. And he said, my observation should not be taken as a statement that there is life on Mars today, because we need to go there to drill the soil, take samples and analyse them before possibly concluding that life is there. Now, so he's talking about going there and drilling the soil to find life. Well, this is rather odd, because he said this in February 2005, and yet in 1976 the Viking probe had been to Mars and drilled the soil and detected life with a labelled release experiment. So we have two completely independent, separate experiments giving essentially the same result, yet they're not tying these together. The scientists are not, you know, he didn't say, oh yeah, well this is what Viking discovered, so I think I'm right.
Just to be clear on this, Andrew, NASA's current position on life on Mars is there's none.
Yeah, they're saying,
not even microbial.
Correct. They will basically say, well, we're still looking at the data.
Right.
We think we don't have any definite evidence that there is life on Mars. We still think there might be, but we're not really sure. That's essentially their position.
Have they admitted to water on Mars at this point in time?
Yes, they've announced that several times.
Right.
We have another picture which we can show, and this is a Viking image from 1979, and it says, this is their caption from the NASA website, and it says, this colour image shows a thin layer of water ice frost on the Martian surface at Utopia Planitia. Okay, so it's not liquid water they're talking about there, but they're saying water ice frost.
Right.
So that's water, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and of course that's what the image should look like, because that's when the colour of the sky has been processed correctly.
So this is decades before they've admitted there's water on Mars.
Right. And I've heard them announce it several times. They announced it in 2006, and now they've been talking about it again with some of the Curiosity images.
And you mentioned the colours. Since, well, they've been messing with the colours coming back from these exploration vehicles, mainly messing with the sky. Mainly,
yeah. I mean, they seem to, occasionally you'll get the odd picture which doesn't show a predominantly red or pink sky. Occasionally they'll show a sort of grey coloured sky or a sort of lighter coloured sky, but the correct colour of the sky is blue on Mars, as I understand it. And also Gilbert Levin has done his own analysis, and he concludes the same. Gilbert Levin, who did the labelled release experiment, also concludes, and I know that Anthony Beckett has spoken on this programme about this, probably, you know, so people can go back to that if they wish. All
right, now there's another chap called Charles Schultz III, who is from Carolina, and he's downloaded thousands of images from NASA of Mars looking at fossils.
Correct. I mean, he's been looking at some of the Spirit and Opportunity, which are two of the rovers which landed on Mars in 2004, and I think one of them is still working 9 years later. It had a lifetime of about 6 months or something, but it's still going. And yes, you're right, he downloaded lots of images from there, and he studied them in detail in sort of with very close eye. And he was recently featured on a news broadcast. Well, I say recently, it was about 2011, just going through his findings with a local news reporter to find out, you know, to show the news reporter what was on these images. And it does appear he's found fossils of trilobites, or trilobites some people call them, and types of shells. And I agree with him, you can clearly see this. And Schultz was actually invited to present this research at a conference that NASA organised, and then he was bounced. He was uninvited from the conference the week before he was scheduled to go. Right.
So NASA haven't had their own biologists looking at these images to try and find fossils then, presumably, or they've not put out any information.
Correct.
On it at all.
There's no official recognition of fossils on Mars, to as my understanding. So if you look at Charles Schultz's research, to me it seems pretty clear what he's found.
Right. Let's take a look at this.
Well, last month, a NASA scientist in Alabama stunned the world when he said he discovered evidence of alien life. His claim was based on fossil remains he supposedly found in a meteorite. The next day, however, NASA said their researchers' work was flawed and unreliable. However, claims of alien life and fossils are nothing new for NASA. For the past 7 years, they've been dealing with the Winsboro man and his research. And his work may very well change our way of thinking forever.
Ever since the Viking probe landed on Mars in 1976, NASA has been trying to find out if life once existed or if it still exists there today. 30 years later, in December of 2006,
today you will hear what many are saying may be the most significant discoveries to date.
NASA scientists released photographs that suggest there is life, pictures that show water on Mars.
We can honestly talk about liquid water on the surface of Mars today.
The news was reported in the national media and was hailed as a major discovery. The only problem, another man says he made the very same discovery nearly 3 years earlier.
You came to the conclusion that there was water and life on Mars when?
The date when I was first certain of it was February 15th, 2004.
Charles Schultz looks and sounds like a modern-day Einstein. Using the Freedom of Information Act, he obtained more than 200,000 Mars images from NASA. And after thousands of hours of research, he came to some startling conclusions.
Many of the things that I've seen look very clearly like the recent erosion or presence of water, liquid water on the surface, and many of the images show what appear to be fossil organisms, marine fossils.
Right, fossils on Mars, and not just a few. Schultz says the planet is littered with them.
Right now, the planet has extremely thin air, very tough living conditions, but it is wet on the surface in many areas, and it is covered with fossil remains from marine organisms. Some of the fossils we found are seashells, and very clearly they are identical to the things we'd find on the Earth. This is a conch shell, apparently, found on the planet Mars, and this is one on the Earth. And you can see there's an absolute identical appearance to both of them.
Schultz showed me picture after picture.
This is a trilobite fossil.
All NASA images.
Opportunity, the rover found on the 158th day of its imaging.
And all of them compelling.
This clearly looks like water flow to me and mud.
It is.
The rover, the Opportunity, these Mars crafts that have gone up there and literally have gotten stuck in the mud?
In many cases, yes.
Schultz's research has the potential to change the way we think about the universe. He's written numerous articles for scientific magazines and books on the subject. The latest is A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. In it, he carefully lays out his research and conclusions.
NASA explained your findings.
Actually, they've ignored it. In the beginning, when I began posting a lot of my information and sending it to them as well, there was some interest, and my website had hits from 40 to 90% from Mars researchers, NASA particularly, and other agencies. But over time, the died off and there was no response. So they actually pretty much ignored what I posted.
NASA Director Charlie Bolden won't speculate on the potential for water or fossils on Mars, but he's hoping the next rover mission, Curiosity, will answer those questions once and for all. It takes off this November. The first data is expected by the fall of next year.
We expect to make discoveries with Curiosity. I don't want to, set great expectations. What we find will be different from what we found before. It will look at the soil of Mars. It's looking for any signs of microbes or microbial life there. It's absolutely incredible what it's going to do.
And when I pressed him on Schultz's claims of fossils on Mars,
I don't know. I wish I could say yes, I do, but I don't know. I really don't.
Bolden referred me to a NASA scientist who's been working on the very same subject.
This activity, especially the fact that it's going on today, to me says that the mid-latitudes of Mars are one of the more remarkable places in the solar system.
Phil Christensen is well known for his work on Mars. Remember that December '06 announcement of water on Mars? Well, Christensen was there, and NASA's conclusions were supported by his research.
NASA's goal, long-term goal, is to land on Mars, collect rocks, and bring them back to Earth so that we can examine them in laboratories here under microscopes and look for any evidence of fossils or any other evidence of ancient life on Mars. I'm very confident that that rover will make discoveries that will really change our thinking. Again, every time we look, we find an interesting place. There were clearly environments on Mars billions of years ago that were very much like the Earth, and it's very possible that life may have started there. Again, that would be a fantastic discovery, and that could be coming in the next year or so.
I think that they have been ready with this for a very long time. The first researchers on the mirror teams, the rover teams, included an oceanographer, a marine biologist who was looking at the images. And that's very telling in its own right. Schultz believes disclosure will happen next year once the rover sends images back to Earth. It's something he says could have happened sooner, but didn't because of religious beliefs.
Many people allow their beliefs to dominate regardless of the facts. And it's not a stab at religion. This is just a presentation of the facts. People who have faith find a way to live with the facts.
You're dealing with science.
That's absolutely correct. You have to work with science and facts.
Is there life on Mars right now?
I do believe so, because nothing we know of would have sterilized the entire planet. Funguses, spores, bacteria could very easily still be in the soil today.
Well, despite his research, Schultz says he's not the person who first discovered life on Mars. He said that honor belongs to Viking mission scientist and current Arizona State University professor, Dr. Gary Levin. Levin believes he discovered microbial life from the soil samples taken from the 2 Viking missions from the 1970s. But NASA has never embraced those findings. Well, a huge announcement from NASA today. Their scientists believe water is flowing on the surface of Mars, and it's believed to be salt water, which could still theoretically sustain life. NASA says striking new images from the mountains of Mars may be their best evidence yet of flowing liquid water. Those images appear to show some sort of water flow on the Mars surface. Now, if true, NASA says this has profound implications in the search for extraterrestrial life. But today's NASA announcement is nothing new for a Winnsboro man. Charles Schultz has been studying the so-called red planet for years, and back in April, he told News 19 viewers that there's microbial life and water on Mars. He believes NASA has known this for years and is releasing the information a little at a time.
Little by little, the information is being given to the public to sort of prepare them for what's to come. The flow of water and the creation of mud is very common on the planet Mars, even today. And this mud flow is terraced. It's in layers, just as you'd expect in any place where the water's flowed. You can see how it's moved around here. And this is actually the geyser that probably was the source of that water. For 45 years, we believed Mars to be as dry as the moon, and yet constantly we're given information that tells us that's not so. It's loaded with water and mineral resources. It's another planet just like the Earth.
If you remember our story back in April, Charles tried to give NASA his findings, and they basically wouldn't listen to him.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about Mars. Now, in the 1950s, Andrew, there was a think tank set up called the Brookings Institute, or the
Brookings Institution, I think.
Institution, and they considered the impact on humanity if life was discovered in the solar system or in any of these missions, and they essentially concluded that we should cover it up if it was found, because the implications would be too disruptive to humanity. And it seems to me that that's what's happened when they've discovered the microbial life on Mars. Because to me, there's no doubt of these experiments that they have found life on Mars, and they've not announced it, albeit microbial in this instance. Now, what about structures on Mars and possibility that intelligent life has been there? We spoke about the secret space program last week.
Did.
And we are both of the view that it's quite likely that some secret group has already been to Mars and possibly has bases on Mars. But is there any evidence of this?
Well, I mean, we heard in that clip from William Hamilton that he said the chap that he'd been in contact with, the colonel in the Air Force, had been on the ship to Mars and he'd gone to an underground base. And at the end of that clip, William Hamilton said, oh, but we don't see any cities on Mars, we don't see any structures. Well, you know, again, I encourage people to go and look for one particular picture. Well, there's a number of particular ones, not all of which we're going to show here, but there's one called the Inca City. If you Google Inca City and Mars, you will find a 1972 Mariner image, and that's NASA's name for it. They call it the Inca City, and you can see rectilinear structures. But what I'd like to draw people's attention to is this image we've got on the screen here, which I first came across, I think, I came across it on Jason Martell's website called X-Facts. I came across it in around about 2004, and it was a very similar image to this one. This is actually a newer image. This was taken in 2008, and I use this image as my internet avatar and so forth. And this is, they call it on the HiRISE website. HiRISE is the name for the High Resolution Imaging Satellite Experiment, I think, or something. Yeah, High Resolution Imaging Science Experiment. It's right in front of me, and I didn't read it.
So this is the University of Arizona, which has access to all of, well, some of NASA's images then? Yeah,
I mean, they've developed some of the imaging technology on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter probe, which is a high resolution camera on it. And you can see there, when I first came across this image, I think in 2009, when I knew they'd taken this, they'd rephotographed this dome structure, as I call it. They had a page on their website, and you can see the caption there: crater with textured mound in central Acidalia planitia, and then it gives you the image number.
So they call it a textured mound.
Textured mound.
Okay.
And that was what was being shown on their website, and that was sometime, I think, let's see, in that was 2009 on their website. That's how their website was in 2009, May the 11th. And I was discussing this with my brother, who's not into this stuff, and he asked me what this peculiar dome image was. So I said, oh, here's the link to the website, and I gave him the link to this page as I thought it was. And then I found that they changed that page to this. Right. In other words, they've redesigned the website and such, and moved around the labels and the menus and so on. But the actual image number is the same. And the caption is the same, which says crater with textured mound in central Acidalia planitia. But as you can see, the dome is gone. So
they might have done that deliberately. It might just be some kind of error. But you can actually find the image if you click on one of the other links. Yeah,
that's right. If you go down to the image at the bottom,
it's still there. They haven't removed it altogether.
It's like a form of soft censorship. The image hasn't gone, but it's less obvious than it was. And one of the images appears to be kind of blacked out, but the other one, the thing is there. So you've got to have a little look for it.
Is there any indication as to the size of that?
Yes, I mean that dome is 530 meters across.
530 meters.
Yeah, I measured that on a previous version of the image.
It's sort of bigger than a sports stadium then?
Yeah, it's pretty big. Right. And it appears to be associated with other structures in that area as well, because if you're going down that area in like a vertical line or sort of south, you will see that there are other structures beneath that dome, which I've got some pictures of.
Now you're calling it a dome. If that had been made by intelligent life, wouldn't the texture on the top be uniform, like hexagonal or something like that? It looks like it's natural as opposed to man-made or intelligence.
I understand what you're saying. I think the overall shape of the structure to me looks man-made, but if you look at this higher resolution image, where you can see like it's got some type of covering, which looks like it does look like some sort of large ice sheets that have formed onto it or something like that.
Looks like ripples on a pond.
It does look like that. It looks like ripples.
If that's 500 meters across, then they're very, very big ripples.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe sort of 10-15 meters across or something like that. I don't know. Right. So to me, if you wanted my honest opinion of that, I'd say it is an artificial structure, but overlaid on that, you've had some type of like stalagmites grow on Earth or something like that.
Some natural phenomenon on top of it.
Some deposits, there's some deposits over the top of it.
And NASA themselves, or the University of Arizona, are calling it a mound because, for me, I can't determine whether that's concave or convex or even flat. But they're calling it a mound. So they're saying that
if you look at what's called the molar data, which is the Mars Orbiting Laser Altimeter, which was on Mars Global Surveyor, they do have a relief map for that.
Right. All right. Okay.
It's not, they've got
and
more
it is
optical
three-dimensional.
data.
It comes up.
It does appear to be, a convex structure sticking up, but you can't get hold of that radar data. They do seem to have classified that data.
They've classified it.
The molar data.
Now, you sent this image and another image to a geologist because you were wanting to enlighten geologists on Earth to these structures just to get their expert opinion as to whether they think that's a naturally occurring thing, albeit on another planet.
Right.
Just tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that was in 2004 when I developed a quite strong interest in this, and I decided to do, just a little bit of finding out. So
here are two images that you found very peculiar from NASA that you sent to this geologist guy. Just tell us what happened then. Right,
so just to explain briefly the one on the right, which we haven't discussed yet, this image is of a structure, I forget the exact location, it's not too far from Olympus Mons, but it's basically a structure which is 3.1 miles long. The longest section of this is about 3.1 miles long. So these were two very interesting images that I'd come across on various websites. So I sent these at random to 42 geologists. I just searched for like university geologist.
As you do.
As you do. And plucked out 42 email addresses that were on university websites and so on. And I ended up getting 3 responses. And I sent them these 2 images, but no other information. I didn't tell them, where they come from. So that I was waiting for them.
So you didn't say they were from Mars?
No, I didn't say what they were from. I just said these were geological structures or something. Can you give me any more information about what processes might form these geological structures? So the first question they should have asked me is, where did these images come from? What's the scale? So I needed them to ask that question,
right?
And then I would give them the information, which is what I did. And I got a couple of responses. And I wrote back to them. I sent them the links. I sent them the links to the NASA website and the USGS website where these images are hosted. And anyway, so one guy, I kind of, obviously latched it. I got his curiosity going. He wrote back to me. I sent him the links, and then he wrote back to me, and he said, "These 2 images from the surface of Mars are certainly puzzling and have been floating around UFO web pages for some time. I am sorry, but I do not believe in big conspiracy theories and that the government is trying to hide something from us concerning Mars or any other planet." But that wasn't the question I asked him. Whether these images...
You weren't even suggesting there was a conspiracy.
Not
You're
at
just
all.
asking him to explain some of the geology of Mars. Simple question.
Right, exactly. And so, he said a few other sort of platitudes, and at the end he said, "Good luck with your investigations." And here I am, just an amateur researcher. He's a geologist. Doesn't he want to investigate these images? For his own interest? I'd obviously, sort of piqued his interest. But he's basically running away from the evidence, which is a common theme with this sort of research. So my point, in saying this and bringing this up, is that if we get the most interesting images, the most inexplicable ones, if the scientists are just going to ignore those, then why are we spending all this money on these research missions? If all the interesting data is going to be put on one side, marginalised, not talked about, attempted to be debunked, as they did with Gilbert Levin.
Yeah, like the Viking mission.
Like the Viking mission.
Life experiments.
Right.
Okay. Now another area of Mars which people talk a lot about and possibly being designed is the Cydonia area. Can you just give us an overall description of why that area is considered by many to be artificial?
Well, of course, Cydonia is this region where we have the face structure, or what appears to be a face. And again, it is claimed that the higher resolution images from 2001 onwards, the face came about as a result of Viking images in I think 1978 or 79, and they got into all the newspapers, all the TV programs and so on. And then they said in 2001, when we had Mars Global Surveyor, MGS, they claimed that these images essentially proved the face was just a pile of rocks. It was a geological feature. I don't necessarily agree with that. But then in the Cydonia region, one of the peculiar things which David Percy had pointed out, I think he's written more about this in his book 2/3, but the most striking thing of all for me was that if you take a segment of Cydonia and overlay it with Avebury in Wiltshire, you know, with the stone circle there, you get a precise correspondence between 3 geological features, and we'll show that correspondence.
We'll take a look at that. So
And
just describe this diagram for us, Andrew.
Yeah, so this was actually an image that I made. I got the Cydonia image from a website, and I then overlaid this with a Google aerial view.
Right, so that's Silbury Hill and Avebury itself, which is in a stone circle.
A stone circle, and we've got this sort of a ditch around the stone circle in Avebury. And if you overlay these 2 images, there are 3 geological features. We have the circle of Avebury matches up with this sort of crater feature or whatever it is on Cydonia. We have some type of mound.
I can see the 2 features there, Andrew. What's the third one?
And the third one is just to the left of the crater. We've got like some type of mound, and that matches up with a group of trees.
Just point to that.
Matches up with a group of trees in Avebury. Like there's a sort of the perimeter of trees around this feature in Avebury. And if you look carefully at this image, I'm told, I haven't checked this, but there are 1,000 points of correspondence if you look at them carefully.
Right.
And the scale is 14:1. So what is 1 metre at Avebury is 14 metres on Cydonia.
Right, so it's 14 times bigger on Mars.
Yeah, correct. So I mean, I don't know. That's what I understand of the measurements.
Right.
So it's very peculiar.
Right. I know that Alan Wilson, in his books, he has correlated the mounds in South Wales to map to the stars. So they're mapping out first magnitude stars. Do you think there's any astronomical connection to the Cydonia landscape?
I've heard various things, but again, it's not something I've studied in depth to make any conclusions about. But clearly, there is a correspondence between Avebury and Cydonia.
And what's your opinion on the 5-sided pyramid?
Again, I think it is probably some type of artificial structure, but I haven't really studied it enough to know, what the significance would be.
But you would say that these are remnants. They're sort of like the pyramids or something from the dim and distant past. They're not something which is being used now. But
I don't think so. Again, we've got limited information to go on, but my feeling is that they are indeed ancient structures.
Now,
Yes.
you did show me one other image, which was an artist's impression of these sort of tunnels, if you like. Obviously, they may not be tunnels, but a structure which shows sort of sticking out of the night. Can you bring that one?
Yeah,
up?
well, we can get that image. This is one. So people have said there are glass tubes on Mars, and this is one of the typical images. This is about 1 mile long.
So is there any geological explanation for that, for those sort of
not that I've
arches?
heard. Not that I've heard. I mean, it's not, the picture itself is a little bit unclear, but it does indeed look like we've got some reflections going on there with some type of bracing on these tubes. Really have no idea what these structures are.
So NASA don't make a statement as to what that is, right?
Not really. I mean, they've tried to claim it's just what they call pareidolia, which is this pattern matching that you do. You see when you look at a cloud, it looks like a teddy bear or something.
Simulacry, I think they call it. Is it?
Possibly that might be another name.
So there's an actual artist's impression that someone's.
That's right. Yeah. So I looked at this and. I found this picture that is this some type of transit system going above and below the surface of Mars.
Is that taking it a bit far?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd need to see it more close up. I'd like to see if we've got any of the newer high resolution images from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. But when I saw this image, I thought, well, that's not quite right because the artist has used the red sky. So I did a bit of my own correction to that image, and I feel that's what it should look like.
All right then, Andrew. Well, thanks for your insights. Fascinating subject matter, and hopefully we will know the truth one day about Mars and the Moon and just what is going on in this alleged secret space program. But thanks for speaking to us, and